The sirens tore through the crisp night air of Oak Ridge Heights, their wailing echoing off the pristine, uniform houses lining the cul-de-sac. Fire truck lights bathed the neighborhood in a harsh red glow, illuminating the billowing smoke that curled into the night sky. But instead of clearing the way, as any rational person would, Karen Masters stood firm, arms crossed, lips pursed in defiance, her expensive silk robe fluttering slightly in the wind. In front of her, her gleaming white SUV sat parked directly in the fire truck's path, blocking the only viable route to the burning home at the end of the street. The firefighters honked. They shouted. They waved frantically, motioning for her to move. Karen didn't budge. Instead, she lifted her phone, hitting record, the glint of smug satisfaction in her eyes undeniable. "You can't just barge in here," she declared, her voice carrying over the crackling flames in the distance. "This is private property. Emergency vehicles require prior HOA authorization before entering Oak Ridge Heights." A chorus of voices erupted from the gathering crowd of neighbors. People were screaming, pleading with her to move her damn car. But Karen barely glanced at them, her entire focus locked on the fire captain, Mark Reynolds, who had stepped out of the truck, his face twisted in disbelief. "Ma'am, we don't have time for this. A man is trapped inside that house. Move your vehicle. Now." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many tragedies unfold because of wasted seconds. Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she jutted her chin forward. "I don't make exceptions. If we let you break the rules now, then what's the point of having an HOA?" Behind her, flames devoured the Whitman home. The fire had jumped from the kitchen to the living room, tearing through furniture, eating at the walls. The Whitmans' elderly father, George Whitman, was still inside, trapped upstairs, his weakened legs unable to carry him to safety. His muffled cries barely carried over the wind. Mark clenched his jaw. He could feel the heat from here, the telltale groan of wood about to collapse. Every second spent arguing was a second closer to disaster. He turned to his crew, already signaling for them to find another way in when something caught his eye. A glowing ember, twisting through the night air. It danced for a moment, carried by the wind, before landing right at the edge of Karen's perfectly trimmed hedges. It took less than a second for the flames to catch. Karen didn't notice the ember at first. She was too busy arguing, too caught up in her own sense of authority to register the gasps from the growing crowd. But as a sickening orange glow flickered at the edges of her vision, she turned, just in time to see the flames crawl up her meticulously manicured hedges, the ones she had personally approved for the HOA's list of acceptable shrubbery. The fire spread fast, licking its way up the perfectly pruned branches, jumping from hedge to hedge like a row of dominoes igniting in sequence. For the first time that night, true fear flashed across Karen's face. She spun back toward the firefighters, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "Put it out," she shrieked, suddenly no longer concerned with protocol. "My house is right there. Do something." Mark Reynolds barely spared her a glance. "We're busy saving a life." The words were clipped, barely masking his disgust. He didn't have time for her selfishness, for her rules, for her self-importance. The fire crew had managed to find a way around her SUV, but the minutes she had wasted arguing could not be undone. The Whitman home was nearly completely consumed, the structure groaning under the strain of the heat. Inside, George Whitman was still trapped, his voice growing weaker by the second. But Karen's attention had snapped entirely to her own house. She stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames as they leaped to the edge of her lawn, creeping toward her pristine white columns and hand-painted front door. The very home she had fought so hard to keep flawless was now about to be reduced to ash. And no one moved to help her. The neighbors, the same ones she had bullied and fined and terrorized for years, stood in stunned silence, watching the inevitable unfold. Some had their phones out, recording. Others whispered, barely able to mask their satisfaction. Not because they were cruel, but because they had lived under her rule for too long. They had watched their neighborhood transform from a place of warmth and community into Karen's personal dictatorship. And now, for the first time in years, they saw her completely powerless. Karen Masters had made too many enemies. From the moment she had moved into Oak Ridge Heights, she had taken control with an iron grip, using her position as HOA president to turn the neighborhood into her own personal fiefdom. Lawn grass had to be precisely 3 inches high, no exceptions. Trash bins left out even a minute past pickup time resulted in immediate fines. Halloween decorations were strictly regulated, because excessive inflatables would bring down property values. And God help anyone who dared leave their car parked on the street overnight, they would wake up to a ticket and a condescending letter about community standards. She patrolled the streets in her silver SUV, clipboard in hand, always ready to document violations. Homeowners learned to scatter the moment they saw her pull up. Conversations would die in hushed whispers, parents would pull their children inside, and even the local mailman despised her, once caught grumbling about her complaints over mailbox heights. Karen didn't just enforce the rules, she lived for them. And worse, she used them as a weapon, fining residents into submission, threatening lawsuits over the most minor infractions, and even blacklisting families from neighborhood events if they spoke out against her. Frank Carter had been one of the few to fight back. As a retired firefighter, he had pleaded with Karen for years to revise some of the HOA's more dangerous policies. The biggest issue? The fire hydrants. Karen had pushed a rule that required all fire hydrants to be hidden from public view, because she thought they were an eyesore. That meant the hydrants were tucked away inaccessible behind decorative enclosures, requiring firefighters to waste valuable time searching for them in an emergency. Frank had warned her repeatedly. "This is a disaster waiting to happen," he'd said in the last HOA meeting, his voice full of exasperation. "If a fire breaks out, these hydrants need to be visible. We can't afford to lose even a second searching for them." Karen had laughed. "Frank, we don't have disasters in Oak Ridge Heights. We have order. Maybe you're just not used to living in a community that values aesthetics." That had been the moment Frank knew someone was going to die because of her. He just hadn't expected it to be her house that burned first. And now here she was, watching helplessly as the fire crept closer to her perfect little world, the very thing she had spent years micromanaging and controlling. She lunged toward her SUV, fumbling for her keys, but the heat was already radiating off her garage door, the fire licking at the edges of her porch. And still, not a single neighbor moved to help. No one rushed to grab a hose. No one shouted for her to get to safety. No one offered even a whisper of comfort. Karen Masters had spent years making enemies. Now, when she needed help the most, she had none left. Karen's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she twisted the keys in the ignition, her fingers trembling. The roar of the flames behind her drowned out the frantic clicking of the engine, refusing to start. Her eyes darted to the side mirror, the fire had already reached the corner of her house. The perfectly white wooden columns framing her front porch were now blackened, the paint bubbling, smoke curling in thick, menacing tendrils. She slammed her fists against the steering wheel. Come on, come on. Her SUV, the very vehicle she had refused to move minutes earlier, was now the last thing standing between her and an inferno. The cruel irony of it all might have made some people reflect, made them realize how their arrogance had led them to disaster. But not Karen Masters. Outside, the neighbors still stood in stunned silence, watching as her kingdom crumbled. Some whispered, some simply stared, and a few, just a few, held up their phones, capturing every single second. She threw the car door open, stumbling out onto the pavement, coughing as smoke filled the air. "Do something," she shrieked, her voice raw, turning to the firefighters, who were still focused on saving the only life that actually mattered tonight. The Whitman's house was nearly gone, but Captain Mark Reynolds and his team had managed to reach George Whitman, hauling him out of the crumbling structure, alive, barely breathing, but safe. Karen, however, wasn't looking at them. She was fixated entirely on herself. "My house," she wailed, stepping toward the blaze, as if by sheer force of will, she could stop it. Her heels skidded on the pavement as she turned toward the firefighters, her face streaked with sweat and fury. "Why aren't you putting out my fire?" Captain Reynolds turned to her, his face unreadable beneath his soot-streaked helmet. "You wasted our time." His voice was even, cold. Final. Karen stared at him, stunned, as if the words physically struck her. Wasted time? No, she had been enforcing the rules. She had been maintaining order. She had been doing what was right. They were the ones who had refused to listen, who had ignored protocol. The flames reached her pristine bay windows, shattering the glass in an explosion of heat. The living room she had curated to perfection, the imported furniture, the antique rug, the artwork she had once bragged was worth more than some people's homes, was now engulfed in flames. The fire raged through the open doorway, swallowing everything in its path. She whipped back toward the neighbors. "Help me," she screamed, eyes darting between them, looking for even one sympathetic face. But there were none. The same people she had fined for mailbox violations, the same families she had threatened with lawsuits over minor infractions, the same neighbors she had bullied and belittled for years, stood there and watched. Some had arms crossed. Others looked almost relieved. No one reached for a garden hose. No one rushed to comfort her. No one moved. Karen had spent years making herself the most feared person in Oak Ridge Heights. But fear and respect were two very different things. She had never inspired loyalty, only resentment. A loud crack split the air as part of the roof collapsed inward, sending a plume of embers spiraling into the night sky. Karen let out a choked sob, stepping back, her body trembling. The weight of the moment finally settling in. Her house was gone. And no one cared. Captain Reynolds let out a heavy breath, turning back to his men. "We've got our priorities straight," he said simply, signaling for them to pack up their gear. Karen watched in disbelief as they turned away. "No, no. You can't just let it burn." She screamed, but her voice was hoarse now, weakened, a fraction of the force it had been earlier. Frank Carter finally spoke, stepping forward from the group of neighbors. His voice was calm, steady, but there was no pity in his tone. "You did this to yourself, Karen." She turned to him, mouth opening and closing, searching for a defense, an excuse, anything. But there was nothing left to say. The reality was in front of her, burning as brightly as the fire consuming her home. For the first time in years, Karen Masters had no power. By morning, the once grand home of Karen Masters was nothing but a charred skeleton, the blackened beam standing against the pale sky like the remains of a forgotten ruin. The smell of burnt wood and melted plastic still lingered in the air, thick and acrid, a harsh contrast to the carefully manicured streets of Oak Ridge Heights. The neighborhood, usually pristine and orderly, now had a gaping hole where her house once stood, and for the first time in years, it felt lighter. Karen, however, saw none of that. She stood at the edge of her ruined property, arms crossed, lips pursed, fury radiating off her like the heat from the embers still smoldering in the debris. She had spent years perfecting this home, enforcing the rules that made this neighborhood what it was, and now, thanks to the sheer incompetence of the fire department, her dream was nothing but ash. She wasn't going to let this go. The first news crews arrived before noon, setting up cameras along the street. Karen had already positioned herself in front of the wreckage, tear-streaked but camera-ready, a carefully cultivated image of tragedy and injustice. The moment the red light flicked on, she launched into her version of events, her voice quivering with manufactured outrage. "The firefighters refused to do their jobs," she declared, gesturing dramatically toward the ruins. "I was only trying to enforce community regulations, and they punished me by letting my home burn. Behind the cameras, neighbors exchanged looks. A few muttered under their breath, some outright rolled their eyes. Karen's rewriting of history was in full force, and she was determined to make herself the victim. The news crews, sensing the absurdity of her claims, pressed her further. A reporter from a local station raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, isn't it true that you blocked the fire truck from reaching the burning home? That's security footage." Karen cut her off. "That footage is taken out of context. I was merely asking them to respect HOA protocol." But the footage wasn't just circulating locally, it had already gone viral. By the afternoon, social media was flooded with clips of Karen standing in front of her SUV, arms crossed, smugly arguing while flames consumed the Whitman house behind her. The internet reacted instantly. The memes came first. A side-by-side comparison of Karen and the burning house, captioned, "Rules are rules." A clip of her waving her phone at the firefighters, edited to show her standing in front of the Titanic as it sank. A viral tweet, "HOA president denies fire truck entry, immediately regrets it." Late-night talk show hosts had a field day. One comedian reenacted the footage with a toy fire truck and a Barbie doll in a pantsuit, mimicking Karen's voice. "Excuse me, sir, do you have the proper paperwork to extinguish this fire?" The audience roared with laughter. Karen, however, wasn't laughing. Instead of backing down, instead of taking a single ounce of responsibility, she did what she always did, she doubled down. By the next morning, she had officially filed a lawsuit against the fire department, accusing them of gross negligence and discrimination against HOA leadership. "They targeted me," she ranted in an online statement, "because they don't respect community standards. If they had acted professionally, my home would still be standing." But she didn't stop there. In an unbelievable twist, she also sued the Whitmans, yes, the family whose house burned first, arguing that their faulty gas line violated HOA safety codes, and that their negligence was to blame for the fire spreading to her property. The backlash was immediate. News outlets tore her apart. Legal experts laughed at the absurdity of her claims. Even the most conservative HOA groups distanced themselves from her. And the final blow came from her own neighborhood. That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called, the first one in years that Karen had no control over. The community center was packed, the residents finally emboldened to speak out. At the front of the room, Frank Carter stood, his voice calm but firm. He laid out the facts in clear, undeniable terms. Karen's obstruction of the fire truck had cost precious time. Her ridiculous HOA rules had made it harder for firefighters to do their jobs. Her arrogance had nearly cost a man his life. And then, in one unanimous vote, Karen Masters was officially removed as HOA president. When she finally heard the news, she exploded. She stormed into the HOA office, demanding to see the records of the vote, convinced it had been some illegal conspiracy against her. The board members simply stared at her. Then one of them pointed to the security camera, the small red light blinking. The entire exchange had been recorded. For the first time in her life, Karen was powerless. Karen sat in the dimly lit living room of her temporary rental, the cheap furniture stiff beneath her as she scrolled through her phone. The notifications never stopped, another viral post, another meme at her expense, another news clip replaying her courtroom meltdown. The world had turned her into a joke, and there was nothing she could do about it. The lawsuit against the fire department had been laughed out of court. The judge barely contained his amusement as security footage played, showing Karen blocking the fire truck, arms crossed, lecturing the captain while flames raged in the background. When given the chance to argue his case, her own lawyer had simply sighed, rubbed his face, and muttered, "We withdraw." Karen had erupted. She tried to argue with the judge, insisted that she was the real victim, that her house burning down was a deliberate attack on HOA leadership. The judge's response? A dismissive wave of his hand as he threw the case out on the spot. By the time she left the courthouse, Karen had become one of the most infamous people on the internet. Parodies of her courtroom meltdown spread like wildfire. Someone even made a cartoon animation of her standing in front of a burning house, screaming, "Rules are rules," while firefighters rolled their eyes. And if that wasn't bad enough, her own neighbors had filed a counter-lawsuit against her. Years of unjust fines, legal threats, and harassment had finally caught up to her. With no HOA backing her, Karen was now just an ordinary homeowner facing the consequences of her own tyranny. Even HOAs in other communities refused to accept her. She applied to move into another exclusive neighborhood, but her name was on a blacklist. Any time she tried to join a new HOA board, her application mysteriously disappeared. For the first time in her life, Karen had no power. But she wasn't done yet. One morning, as she scrolled through real estate listings, she saw an ad for a brand new luxury development just a few towns away. The community was still in its early stages, and they were looking for an experienced HOA president to establish order. Karen's lips curled into a slow, triumphant smile. Maplewood Estates, or Oak Ridge Heights, as they called it now, had been too small-minded to appreciate her. But there were other places. Other neighborhoods. Other communities in desperate need of structure. She straightened her posture, clicked on the application link, and began typing. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.